The courtroom was very quiet when my sister said it. She was sitting in the witness box in a cream-colored blazer she had bought specifically for this. I was fairly certain, the kind of purchase that announces itself. Her attorney had just asked her to describe, in her own words, the nature of my mental state over the past 3 years. She took a breath. She folded her hands on the railing in front of her, and then she said, clearly and without hesitation, that I had never been stable, that the family had always known it, that my episodes, her word episodes, had made it impossible for anyone around me to trust my account of events, including the events that had brought us all into this room today. She did not look at me while she said it. She looked at the judge. The judge wrote something down. He did not react. He simply wrote, and the room stayed quiet. And my sister sat there in her new blazer, looking like a woman who had just said something reasonable. I had been waiting for that moment for 11 months, not with dread, with patience, because I had learned over the course of those 11 months that there is a particular kind of person who believes their version of events is the only version that will ever matter, and that the most effective thing you can do with that belief is let it run all the way to its conclusion. To tell you how we got there, I need to start about 2 years earlier, in the house where we both grew up. My name is Claire Hoffman. I am 43 years old. I am a licensed estate attorney, which means I spend most of my professional life sitting across from families during the worst administrative moments of their lives. The weeks and months after someone dies, when grief and money and old resentments converge in ways that no one is ever quite prepared for. I have seen siblings stop speaking over a dining room table. I have watched cousins arrive at mediation sessions, having not made eye contact in 4 years. I have read wills that seemed designed, whether consciously or not, to start fires. After 15 years of this work, I thought I understood family conflict reasonably well. I did not understand it as well as I thought. We grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a house on Bryden Road in the Oldie Town East neighborhood. Wide front porches, old maple trees, the kind of street where the houses have real history, and the neighbors have been there long enough to remember your parents when they were young. My mother had lived in that house for 38 years. She raised my sister Renata and me there after our father left. When I was 9 and Renata was 6, she planted the garden in the back herself, over the course of about a decade, adding to it every spring until it was genuinely beautiful, dense and layered, and slightly wild in the way that gardens become when someone loves them rather than manages them. My mother's name was Elaine. She died in October, 2 years before any of this reached a courtroom. She was 71. The death was not unexpected. She had been ill for about 18 months, but unexpected and prepared for are not the same thing, and I do not think either Renata or I was truly prepared, regardless of what we told each other and ourselves during those 18 months. What I can tell you about Renata is that she was charming in the specific way of people who have learned that charm is more efficient than effort. She was 3 years younger than me and had spent most of her adult life in a comfortable marriage to a man named Douglas, who worked in commercial real estate and had a talent for making other people feel slightly less intelligent than they were. Renata and Douglas had 2 children, a house in Dublin, the Columbus suburb, not the country, and the kind of social life that required a shared calendar and regular dry cleaning. From the outside, their life looked very organized. I had learned, over many years, that the outside of things was where Renata put her energy. The first indication that something was wrong came about 6 weeks before my mother died. I had driven to Bryden Road on a Tuesday evening to sit with her. I did this most Tuesdays and Thursdays, and had been doing it for most of the previous year. My mother was tired that evening, more than usual, and we did not talk much. I sat beside her bed and read while she rested, and at some point she reached out and put her hand on my arm and said, without any particular lead-up, "I changed the will, Claire. Last month. I want you to know." I asked her what she meant. She said she had divided the estate differently than she had originally planned, that the house and the garden and the accounts would go to me to manage, with the understanding that I would handle the estate costs and maintain the property while Renata received a direct cash distribution from the life insurance. She said she had thought about it carefully and spoken to her attorney, And this was what she wanted. I told her I understood. I asked if she had told Renata. She said she was going to, that she was waiting for the right time. She died 6 weeks later, without having found it. On the kitchen counter at Bryden Road, there was a ceramic mug my mother had used every morning for as long as I could remember. Dark blue, slightly misshapen in the way of hand-thrown pottery, with a small chip on the handle that she had never gotten repaired, because she said it made it easier to hold. After she died, I kept going back to the house to deal with the estate paperwork, and every time I walked into that kitchen, the mug was still there on the counter where she had always kept it. I did not move it. It felt wrong to move it, so it just stayed there, dark blue and slightly imperfect, while everything around it began to change. Renata found out about the will at the reading, which I had not arranged. Her attorney later tried to suggest that I had deliberately timed the disclosure to disadvantage her, which was not true. But it was the kind of suggestion that sounded plausible to people who did not know the full sequence of events, which turned out to be most of the people Renata spoke to in the weeks that followed. The reading took place in my office, on a Wednesday morning in November. 3 weeks after my mother's funeral, Renata arrived with Douglas, which I had not expected. The reading had been scheduled for family only, and Douglas was not named in the will, but I did not say anything about it because the morning was already tense, and I did not want to make it worse before it had even started. My mother's attorney, a careful man named Robert Stiles, who had known my mother for 20 years, read the will in full. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Renata said, "That's not right." Robert told her he understood. This might be surprising, and that he was happy to answer any questions about the process. Renata said, she would never have done this. Someone influenced her. The word she used specifically was influenced. She said it looking at me. I did not respond. I looked at Robert and asked him to explain the timeline of the will's execution, which he did. My mother had updated the document 8 weeks before her death, with 2 witnesses present. On a day when I had not been at the house, I was in a client meeting in Worthington that afternoon, which my calendar confirmed and my assistant could corroborate. Robert had met with my mother privately. The changes had been her idea, discussed over 2 separate appointments. None of this mattered to Renata that morning. She stood up, said she would be contesting this, and left with Douglas before Robert had finished speaking. The mug was on the kitchen counter when I stopped by the house that evening. I stood in the kitchen for a while without turning on the overhead light, and I thought about my mother saying, "I want you to know," and the way she had looked when she said it, tired but deliberate, the way she looked when she had decided something. I went home and called my own attorney that night, not to fight, to be ready. What happened over the next 11 months was, in some ways, less dramatic than it sounds, and in other ways, considerably stranger than I had anticipated. Renata filed a challenge to the will on the grounds of undue influence, the legal argument being that I had manipulated my mother during a period of diminished capacity. This required her to establish 2 things. First, that my mother's mental capacity had been compromised at the time of the will change. Second, that I had exercised improper influence over her decisions. Neither of these things was true. But truth, in legal proceedings, is not simply what happened. It is what you can demonstrate happened, with documentation, with witnesses, and with enough specificity that the other side cannot introduce enough doubt to obscure it. I knew this. 15 years of estate law had taught me exactly what a will contest looked like from the inside, how long they took, what evidence mattered, and which arguments tended to land with judges, and which ones sounded better in a conference room than they ever did in court. The difficulty was that I could not represent myself. An attorney representing herself in her own family matter is, as my colleagues would confirm, a reliable recipe for poor judgment, and so I retained a woman named Patricia Osei, who had been practicing probate litigation in Columbus for 22 years, and who had a reputation for being extremely difficult to rattle. Patricia's first instruction to me was this: do not speak to Renata outside of formal legal channels. Do not respond to her emails directly. Do not engage with whatever she says to mutual friends or extended family. Let the record be built in the right places. This was harder than it sounds. Renata was not quiet during those 11 months. She told our Aunt Margaret, who lived in Dayton, that I had been manipulating my mother for years, that I had isolated her, that I had undermined her relationship with Renata, that the Tuesday and Thursday visits had been a strategic campaign rather than ordinary family care. She told Douglas's family, several of whom had met my mother twice. She told people from her church. She told the neighbors on Bryden Road, one of whom called me in a state of some distress to say she had heard things she did not believe but wanted me to know she had heard them. I thanked her. I did not elaborate. I wrote down the date and content of the call in the notebook I had started keeping for this purpose. A plain black notebook, narrow-ruled, that I carried with me most places and added to whenever something happened that seemed worth recording. It was not elegant documentation. It was just a habit I had developed over years of client work. Write it down while it is fresh, even if you are not sure whether it will matter. Priya was the one who finally said the thing I had been circling around for weeks, without saying it myself. Priya had been my closest friend since law school. We had studied for the bar exam together at a sticky table in a 24-hour diner in Columbus, surviving on bad coffee and mutual stubbornness. And we had stayed close through 2 decades of our lives diverging and occasionally reconverging. She worked in corporate law, which meant she understood legal process without being invested in this particular one, which made her useful in a way that my colleagues, who had opinions, sometimes were not. She came over on a Sunday evening in January, about 3 months into the contest, and I showed her the notebook. She read through it at the kitchen table while I made tea, turning pages slowly, occasionally going back to reread something. When she finished, she closed it and set it on the table and looked at me. She said, "Claire, do you understand what she's actually doing?" I said, "I thought so." Priya said, "She's not contesting the will. She's contesting you. The will is just the document. What she's actually arguing is that you are not a credible person, that your account of events cannot be trusted because there is something wrong with you. That's the strategy. If she can make that land, nothing else matters." I had understood this intellectually. Hearing Priya say it plainly, at my kitchen table on a Sunday evening, made it real in a different way. She picked up the notebook and held it toward me. "This is good," she said. "But you need more than this." She was right. Over the following weeks, I built the documentation properly. Robert Stiles provided a detailed account of both meetings with my mother, including his observations about her mental state. She had been clear, specific, and consistent across both appointments, and had asked questions that indicated she understood the implications of the changes she was making. He had noted this in his file at the time, precisely because he understood that changes made during a period of illness sometimes attracted scrutiny. My mother's primary care physician provided records from the 18 months of her illness, including cognitive assessments conducted at regular intervals. The assessments showed consistent results, mild decline in energy and physical capacity, no evidence of cognitive impairment affecting decision-making. Before I tell you what I found next, tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Where are you watching from? I'm always surprised how far these stories travel. 2 of the Tuesday and Thursday neighbors, people who had known my mother for years and who had seen me at the house regularly, agreed to provide statements about what those visits had actually looked like. One of them, a retired teacher named Gloria, who lived directly across the street and who had spent 30 years noticing things, wrote 4 careful paragraphs describing what she had observed. Me arriving, staying for 2 to 4 hours, leaving. My mother in the garden on good days, the 2 of us on the porch. Nothing that looked like pressure. Nothing that looked like anything other than a daughter visiting her mother. Renata's attorney requested my medical records during the discovery process, on the basis of a claim Renata had apparently made that I had a history of psychological instability that was relevant to the question of my influence over my mother. Patricia objected, and the request was substantially limited. But the attempt itself told me something about where the case was going. My mother's blue ceramic mug was still on the kitchen counter at Bryden Road. I had been managing the property as the will specified, and I went there every week or 2 to check on things. Every time I walked into that kitchen, it was there. I kept not moving it. At some point, I stopped asking myself why, and just accepted that it was staying. I found the letters in February, 8 months after the contest began, in a box in my mother's bedroom closet that I had not yet gone through. There were 12 of them, written in my mother's handwriting, addressed to Renata. They were not sealed. They had never been sent. I sat on the floor of the closet and read all 12 of them. They covered a span of about 4 years. The earlier ones were warm, full of ordinary news and observations, the kind of letters people write to children they love. But starting about 2 years before my mother's death, the tone changed, not dramatically, quietly. The way things change when someone has been patient for a long time and has finally run out of patience. In the later letters, my mother wrote about specific incidents. Times when Renata had cancelled plans without explanation. Times when she had made comments about money that my mother found hurtful. One occasion when Renata had said something in front of the grandchildren that my mother described in careful, restrained language as unkind. She wrote about feeling invisible during some visits. She wrote about the garden and how she wished Renata would come and sit in it with her the way she used to. None of these letters had been sent. My mother had written them and kept them in a box. I photographed every one of them. Then I called Patricia. By the time we reached the trial date, I had Robert's detailed file notes, the cognitive assessments, the neighbor statements, the calendar record showing my whereabouts on the day the will was changed, my mother's medical records, and 12 unsent letters that described, in my mother's own handwriting, the nature of her relationship with Renata over the years preceding the will change. I had what I needed. I had had it for some time. The remaining weeks before trial were just preparation. Patricia and I met the week before the trial for what she called a full review. 4 hours in her office, going through every piece of evidence in sequence, identifying the likely points of attack, and making sure we had clean responses to each one. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a building in the short north neighborhood, with a window that looked out onto a street lined with galleries and coffee shops, and people walking dogs. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September. I had been in legal proceedings of various kinds for most of my professional life. But sitting across from my own attorney, reviewing my own family's documents, had a quality I had not fully anticipated. Something between professional focus and something more personal that I kept setting aside. Patricia was not warm in the conventional sense, but she was thorough, and thoroughness was what I needed. She went through every exhibit, every statement, every potential line of cross-examination. She asked me questions in the blunt way of someone preparing you for worse questions from someone who wants you to fail. At the end of 4 hours, she closed her folder and said, "The letters are your strongest piece of evidence, not because they prove anything legally, but because they establish something the other side cannot argue with. Your mother's own account, in her own words, of what her relationship with Renata actually felt like. Juries respond to handwriting. I told her we had a judge, not a jury," she said. "Judges are people." When I left her office, I drove to Bryden Road. I had no particular reason to go. There was nothing to check on, nothing that needed doing. I parked in front and sat in the car for a while, looking at the porch. The garden was mostly done for the season, but my mother's rose bushes along the front fence were still showing a few late blooms, stubborn and slightly ragged in the way of things that refuse to accept that the season is over. I went inside. I stood in the kitchen. The blue mug was on the counter where it always was, and I looked at it for a long moment. That small chip on the handle, the slight irregularity of the shape. And I thought about my mother holding it every morning for however many years, and I thought she knew what she was doing. She knew exactly what she was doing when she changed that will. She had just run out of time to explain it to everyone who needed to understand. I did not say any of this out loud. There was no one there to say it to. The trial lasted 2.5 days. Renata's attorney led with the undue influence argument, framing it carefully. The isolation narrative, the suggestion of psychological manipulation, the implication that my regular visits to my mother had been something other than what they appeared to be. He called 2 witnesses, a cousin who had limited contact with my mother in her final years, but who testified to what Renata had told her, and a former neighbor who had moved away from Bryden Road 3 years earlier, and whose testimony about my mother's state of mind during that period was accordingly limited. Then he called Renata. She was composed on the stand. She had clearly prepared carefully, and she delivered her account in the measured, regretful tone of someone describing a painful situation they had not sought. She talked about our childhood, about our mother, about what she described as a gradual change in my mother's behavior over the last several years. A withdrawal, an increasing tendency to rely on me exclusively, a diminished interest in Renata's visits. Her attorney asked her to describe her understanding of my mental and emotional stability. Renata looked at the judge. She said I had never been stable, that the family had always known it, that my episodes had made it impossible for anyone around me to trust my account of events. The room was quiet. I wrote nothing in my notebook. I looked at the table in front of me. Patricia stood up for cross-examination. She was brief. She established that Renata had no medical training, no professional basis for her characterization of my mental state, and no documented instances of the episode she had described. She asked Renata when she had last visited my mother at Bryden Road before the will was changed. Renata said she visited regularly. Patricia produced a calendar, the one my mother had kept on the kitchen wall, which I had found and preserved, and walked through the 6 months preceding the will change, date by date. In that period, Renata had visited 4 times. Patricia introduced the cognitive assessments. She introduced Robert Stiles' file notes. She introduced Gloria's statement. And then she introduced the letters. She did not read all 12 of them into the record. She read 3, carefully selected, read slowly, without editorial comment. Just my mother's handwriting, rendered into spoken words in a quiet courtroom. When she finished reading the 3rd letter, the room was very still. The judge asked Renata's attorney if he wished to respond to the letters. He said he would address them in closing argument. The judge made a note. Then he looked over the tops of his glasses at Renata, who was still on the stand, and he said, "Miss Renata, you've testified that your mother's relationship with your sister fundamentally changed in the years before her death." He paused. "Can you explain to me why, in the 6 months before she updated her will, your mother wrote you 12 letters that she never sent?" The room was completely still. Renata opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at her attorney. Her attorney said, "Objection, Your Honor, the witness." The judge said, "I'm asking the witness directly. You may answer, Miss Renata." She looked at the letters on the exhibit table. She looked at the judge. She said, "I didn't know about those letters." The judge said, "I understand that. I'm asking if you can explain them." She could not. There was nothing to say. The letters existed. My mother had written them. No explanation Renata could offer in that moment was going to change what was in them, or why they had never been sent. I looked at the blue ceramic mug I had brought from the house that morning. I had not planned to bring it, but I had picked it up on my way out of the kitchen and put it in my bag without quite deciding to. And it had been sitting in my bag under the table through the entire proceeding. I did not take it out. I just knew it was there. The judge ruled in our favor. 3 weeks after the trial concluded, the will stood as written. The estate proceeded as my mother had intended. The legal costs, which had been substantial on both sides, were allocated in accordance with the ruling, which meant that Renata bore her own costs entirely. I did not feel triumphant. That is the honest answer. I felt tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. And the absence of the weight is its own kind of strange. Douglas called me 2 days after the ruling. I almost did not answer. When I did, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want you to know I told her not to pursue this, that I thought she was wrong." I believed him. Douglas had many qualities I did not admire, but I did not think he was dishonest. I told him I appreciated him saying so. He said, "She's not doing well. I'm not asking you to do anything. I just thought you should know." I thanked him and ended the call. My Aunt Margaret called the following week, from Dayton. She had been one of the people Renata had told her version to, back at the beginning, and she had believed it, or at least had not disbelieved it, which in practice amounts to the same thing. She apologized. She said she should have asked more questions. She said she was sorry she had let Renata's account go unchallenged for as long as she had. I told her I understood why she hadn't. Renata was convincing. "She always had been," Margaret said. "Your mother knew what she was doing. I always knew that." I think. I just didn't say it loudly enough, I said. She did. She absolutely did. Bryden Road in November was stripped and quiet, the way that neighborhood gets when the leaves are fully down and the light changes to that flat gray that lasts until March. I went to the house on a Tuesday, as I had done for years, and walked through the rooms. The garden was dormant. The rose bushes had been cut back. The kitchen was cold because I had turned the heat down to a maintenance level, and I turned it up when I came in and stood waiting for the room to warm. The blue mug was still on the counter. It was always on the counter. I had been managing this house for over a year, and I still had not moved it. And I had stopped trying to explain to myself why. I made a cup of tea in it that afternoon, first time I had ever used it. I stood at the kitchen window and drank the tea and looked at the back garden and thought about my mother out there every spring, adding to something one season at a time, patient in the way that gardeners have to be patient. About 10 months after the ruling, on a morning in early September, I was at the Bryden Road house doing a final walkthrough before listing it for sale. This had taken longer to decide than I expected. The will gave me the discretion to manage the property as I saw fit, and I had spent most of the preceding year doing exactly that, maintaining it, paying the taxes and utilities, occasionally sitting in the garden when the weather allowed. But the decision to sell was the right one, and I had known it for some time, and September felt like the right moment. I went through every room. The garden had come back beautifully that summer, in the way that established gardens do when they have been planted by someone who understood what they were doing. It did not need much intervention, just tending. I had learned to tend it well enough. I would miss it. In the kitchen, I stood at the counter for a while. The blue ceramic mug was in its usual place, as it had been for the entire time I had been coming here. I picked it up and held it. The chip on the handle fit under my thumb exactly the way it must have fit under my mother's. That slight irregularity that she had said made it easier to hold. It had been easier for her. It turned out it was easier for me too. I wrapped it in a dish towel and put it in my bag to take home. It sits on my kitchen counter now, in my apartment in the short north, in the window that gets the morning light, not in a special place. Just on the counter, where things that are used every day tend to live. There is a particular kind of grief that is not about missing someone, but about finally understanding them. Understanding why they made the choices they made, what they were trying to protect, what they were trying to say in the years when saying it directly felt too difficult or too costly. I think about my mother writing those 12 letters and keeping them in a box. And I think about what it takes to hold something like that inside you. And I think about her finding, eventually, a different way to say it through a legal document, in a lawyer's office. On a Tuesday afternoon when I was in Worthington at a client meeting, she found a way. She always found a way. Here is what I keep returning to, when I let myself think about it. How much do we trust the performance of a person, rather than the record of who they have actually been? And how long does it take? In families, in courtrooms, in any room where someone has decided to tell a story about someone else, for the evidence to become louder than the story. I do not have a clean answer to either question. I am not sure clean answers are available. What I know is that my mother understood something I had to spend 11 months proving, that the truth does not need to be the loudest thing in the room. It just needs to be the most documented. She wrote 12 letters she never sent. And in the end, those letters said everything. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story stayed with you, I would be honored if you shared it with someone who might need it. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from, and whether you have ever had to choose truth when silence would have been easier. I read every single one. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe. I have many more to share, and I would love to have you here for the next one.